Hello guys, and welcome back to another Conflict of Nations World War III video. Today, I'm going to go over a research guide for this game, unpacking 3 different strategies. One strategy, highly focused on being a one-size-fits-all solution that you could use for basically any country in the game. A second strategy, which is focused on being budget-based early game, but also strong, so you have enough resources to focus in things like missiles and heavy aircraft. And a third, naval-based strategy, for naval countries such as Japan and the Philippines, that focuses on dominating the Navy for late game. One thing that's important to understand before we get into these specific research paths is the fact that they're going to change based on your specific situation. Every single game in Conflict of Nations World War III is different, so it's important to understand that what I say, especially for the late game suggestions in this video, may not fit for your game. So it's important to understand that, say your enemies have a super strong air force, you're not going to want to invest in artillery, but you're going to want to invest in air defenses. Simple things like that are just important to stay aware of when we unpack these research. So the first strategy we're going to go over is a one-size-fits-all solution, a specific path that can fit almost any country in the game. And the first research you're going to want to make is in motorized infantry. These infantry are the basic infantry in the game. They can conquer territory, they have decent health, decent movement speed, and decent damage. They're basically the average infantry that most accounts use. Following your research into that, you're probably going to want to use the main battle tank to support it. And this is going to be another day 1 or maybe day 3, depending on which doctrine you have, research for you. If you really don't want the main battle tank, I would recommend the armored fighting vehicle. One of these 2 armored vehicles is critical to integrate into your infantry stacks. I would probably recommend 2 armored vehicles for 1 infantry if you can manage to do that based on your resources, but if not, a 50-50 split or even have a few more infantry than armored vehicles is fine, but it's important moving into the mid-game that you always have these armored vehicles in your stacks. These will increase the damage and health of your stacks, ensuring that they can be competitive, especially going against things such as airstrikes or other players and militaries. You're going to want to use the main battle tank if you're in a heavily land-based area, such as Europe or Asia, which is usually very flat. And the armored fighting vehicle is more recommended in places such as Africa or South America, which have high amounts of forests and high terrain. The armored fighting vehicles have a higher movement speed on. Your third investment is either going to be into support or into an air force. And this is basically down to personal preference, but you're either going to want to use some kind of support vehicle, such as the multiple rocket launcher or the artillery. Probably not the artillery, but if you are running out of resources and haven't had a super successful early game, that one is an option. Or into strike fighters. Now, strike fighters don't come out until day 2 or 3, but if you want an air force, it's important to note that you're also going to need airfields. So airplanes don't have infinite range, and you're going to need to build these airfields to ensure that they can continue to strike deeply into enemy territory. So that is a bit of an investment, but if you don't want to do that and want to continue on your full land-based empire, it's probably going to be the multiple rocket launcher. Now, another thing that's very important to get down early game is Navy. And for certain players, they prefer to go infantry and then into armored, and then immediately into their Navy. Again, this is personal preference. I typically go infantry, army, then air force or support, depending on the country that I chose, and then I go into my Navy. And I specifically instantly will research the cruisers, since these ones are the best ones at striking cities from the water or doing naval combat. But Navy becomes very important late game and mid game, so it's important that you get them early on. And then by the time you have your infantry, your armored troop, maybe 1 support troop, or your fighters, it's going to be important, or your fighters and your Navy, it's going to be very important to begin upgrading them. Now, you're going to want to be upgrading them throughout. I would recommend 1 research slot goes to upgrading existing troops. Like, you're going to want to start upgrading your infantry as soon as the infantry upgrades come out. So, for example, say you just researched the main battle tank, and the new upgrade for infantry has not come out yet, because it's not the day that it comes out. You're going to want to upgrade your main battle tank while researching, say, your strike fighter. This means that you can keep your existing troops updated and well competitive against the enemy's troops, while also adding to your arsenal through researching new things. And throughout the mid-game, I personally, if you're just following the one-size-fits-all pattern, wouldn't go into something like missiles or officers or submarines, unless you're using officers in your strategy. I personally wouldn't do that. I would focus on upgrading my existing troops. And then late game, it really depends on your specific situation. A one-size-fits-all solution simply doesn't work late game. Late game, usually when it's one coalition versus another coalition, you're going to want to be looking at what that coalition focuses on and then doing whatever you can to counter it. So there is really no research path for that. That's kind of just like looking at what they have, seeing what your allies have, and then seeing what nobody has yet. So say you're in a coalition of 4 other players. You're going to want to see, okay, nobody has an extremely strong navy, but the enemies all have an extremely strong navy. So I'm going to fully upgrade my cruisers. And then I'm going to produce cruisers like crazy. That's something that really just depends on where you are in the game. So, moving on to research strategy number 2. This is going to be a little bit more budget of a strategy that focuses closely onto specialized units, such as missiles and submarines early game. This strategy, I just use it whenever I want to have a fun screw-around game, or whenever I have a country that doesn't have great resources, like if I'm the 61st player into a 64-player lobby, and I don't get a great country, I have to follow this strategy because I just don't have the resources to build main battle tanks early game. So for this strategy, you're going to want to use the National Guard as your infantry. The National Guards do not require army bases. They require recruiting offices in every city, and then you can build them in every city. The only downside is that their health equals the morale of the city, which means it's very difficult to use these late game, and you're going to want to integrate them with either a ton of armored troops or a different infantry late game. But for early game, when you're deploying them out of your homeland cities, you usually are going to have at least 73, 75, or even 90, depending on how good you're doing, morale in all your cities. And it's usually not that much of a problem. And then you can get these National Guards out pretty cheaply. And then integrating into that is the combat recon vehicle. I said earlier that this one was a little bit cheaper and a little bit less strong, but you can really mass produce it. You set up the basic buildings that you need to make it, and then you just pump it out. And this strategy uses less resources, but gets you a ton of troops. And when some enemies see these massive stacks that you're going to have, with stacks of National Guards integrated with combat recon vehicles, it's pretty intimidating. And then where you go from here pretty much depends on whatever you want to do. Some people will use this strategy because they're crazy and try to get nuked early game. That's not really a strategy to win the game. It's more of just a strategy to have fun. You can do that. Some people will take this strategy and then build a killer navy. They'll just instantly research cruisers like day 3. And then because they had super cheap stuff, they have a ton of resources that they can pour into that. And then some people will take the way that the strategy probably goes and work on support troops, such as multiple rocket launchers, and an air force. Since you're going to have enough resources to be able to do that, you can pour money into support troops and an air force, and then a navy. Because you didn't spend as much on infantry and armored, you can really specialize into all different categories. Having strong support troops, strong fighters, and a strong navy is definitely something that helps to dominate the mid-game and the late game. This strategy is really quite simple. You just go into the National Guard, into the combat recon vehicle, and then you build an air force, you build support troops, and then you build a navy. Another way that people take this strategy is you can build heavies, you can build missiles, some people will build submarines on top of their navy. It really depends, but the core of the strategy is just starting with those 2 very cheap units, so then you can go and build a whole bunch of other things once you get to mid-game. And other than that, our third strategy is going to be a completely naval-based strategy. And this strategy is going to start very similarly to our other strategy with the National Guards and then the combat recon vehicles. This is where we're just going to start off with as cheap land troops as possible. And then from there, we're instantly going to research cruisers and then submarines. This gives us a super dominant naval position. This naval position is very important to note. This is not very useful early game. Early game, people aren't really worrying about their navies all that much. All it does give you is it gives you a leg up when it comes to late game. Having this position is very dangerous early game because you're pouring very heavily into your navy. But who knows? Say, for example, you're Ethiopia, you have a super strong navy. Kenya can just come up with their motorized infantry and their main battle tanks, and they're going to pummel your National Guards and combat recon vehicles. So it's definitely the kind of strategy that you're going to want to have a strong coalition, or just be able to use your navy in a very strategic way and just instantly send them to get somebody very fast. For example, if you're Ethiopia, you can build a strong navy and go and attack Kenya's 2 port cities. And then they're already down 2 cities if you've been attacking them for 2 days straight. That now when you send your troops in, Kenya's down resources, and now you have a strong army. This strategy is very useful if you have lost late games and are confident you can make it to late game, and just want to focus on your. Okay, with those strategies all finished, I'm just going to move into a few different tips and tricks for using certain unit types. And the main thing that I'm going to want to talk about is officers. Now, officers can really integrate into any of these strategies. The only issue is they're pretty expensive. Their research cost is very, very easy. But when you pull up actually trying to build them, they get pretty costly. So what I would recommend with the officers is if you are sitting in a very dominant mid-game position, these will definitely push you over the top to be number 1 or number 2 in the late game. They are very strong, they provide extra stats, and they buff all of your troops. See, for example, this one, the army boost, this buffs all the units in the army. They can storm position, meaning that they basically don't care if the enemy has entrenchment bonuses. And they deal decent damage as units themselves. I would recommend them, as I said, if you're in a dominant mid-game position and want that to carry over. The best way to ensure if you have a strong mid-game position to ensure you have a strong late-game position is to have a strong navy. But to ensure that your army strength remains strong going mid-game to late-game, officers definitely make sure less of your units die in battle and ensure that you have a stronger army late-game. These are something very experienced players will use. They can be used also on your navy, they can be used on your air force, they can be used on anything. They basically just make your troops stronger, and they're definitely very good. But it's very important not to sacrifice making lots of troops for making officers. If you're low on resources, don't make 1 officer, make 5 infantry instead. It's just much more useful to have 5 infantry over 1 officer in your army, only when you're doing bad. If you're doing really good, always build an officer. But if you're not doing good, make sure that you're prioritizing building infantry and prioritizing building tanks and support troops and maybe an air force and a navy instead of putting your money and resources into officers. Because officers are very useful, but you need to have an army before you can have. Other than that, thank you guys for watching. I might do a second part in this video since there are other strategies that focus on other things such as air forces, or there are other just fun strategies that use things such as these heavies for fun stuff. I just didn't cover them in this video because I didn't want this video to be 40 minutes long. But if you would like to see those, let me know down in the comment section. If you have any other suggestions for videos, let me know down in the comment section. If you like, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you in the